You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges.
Hello and welcome to South Dakota Public Broadcasting's live coverage of the governor's budget address. I'm Stephanie Rissler alongside Lee Strubinger. In just a few minutes, Governor Dennis Daugaard will deliver his budget recommendations for fiscal year 2020. The retiring governor will also deliver his farewell address as he looks back over his time in office.
The governor's final address will look at the state's economy in addition to current revenue and expense projections. That will include the current fiscal year and next fiscal year starting in July of 2019. Daugaard stepped into the role of Chief Executive Officer in 2011, and due to term limits, he was unable to run for re-election this year.
So right now we are in the House of Representatives. We are paying tribute to our servicemen and women. The Lieutenant Governor has taken the podium. This would be a good time to throw it now to our House of Representatives as we begin the budget address here on South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Bushes have been great friends of South Dakota. Let us pause and wish God's blessing on the Bush family and the President. Thank you. Would you also join me right now in recognizing a true honor of a dear friend that I met here in the legislature? I call him a brother of a different mother, but we are brought together to serve everyone, and the greatest foundation of the gifts I've received in over 20 years of being in this building is the lifelong friends I've made, and it's going to be a true honor on the 5th to pass the gavel, 5th of January, to pass the gavel to Lieutenant Governor-elect Larry Roden. On January 8th, 2011, I was honored, prior to that, of course, to be asked to join the Daugaard family in his administration. His inaugural speech on the 8th of January 2011 struck me with the words that we live in the reverberation of today. He said that even with all of the problems facing our state and nation, that he was very optimistic about South Dakota's future because we've always overcome our challenges. And we've done that by embracing our values of self-reliance and frugality, hard work and perseverance. This grandson of Danish immigrants learned these values from his amazing parents. And the lives that these values continue to instill on us are an inspiration. Dennis has worked tirelessly day and night, persevering to improve the quality of our lives. Governor and Linda, you are indeed impactful leaders, servant leaders. In addition to just these past 8 years, you have personified a passion for our great state, the people of our state, regardless of background, creed, beliefs, etc. And from those who are assailed by the wrath of nature and our fires and floods and blizzards, you have always been there. And for those in need, especially our infants and children, Linda, you have always been there. With prophetic vision, the governor closed his inaugural address saying and extolling that as long as we embrace our values, our best days are ahead. And with his energy and with his compassion and with his love of the people of this great state, he has accomplished that dream. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to introduce my friend, my governor, the governor of the great state of South Dakota for his last budget address, Dennis Daugaard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Sit down. Sit down. Okay, sit down now. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. All right. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. It's been a great 8 years, and Lynn and I have been so honored, and you honor us again today. Thank you so much. As you know, this is my last budget address, and before I get into the nuts and bolts of that, I'd like to congratulate and welcome our Governor-elect Kristi Noem and her husband Brian Noem. Let's welcome them to South Dakota. Now, the address that you hear today will be a little atypical. Work on preparing this budget, of course, began as usual in the summer and fall, and I've been meeting with state agencies and continuing into the fall. Then over the past month, Governor-elect Noem has been involved a little bit and is aware of the budget address I'm going to be making to you. As the outgoing governor, it's my duty under statute to offer this address to you today, and so I want to fulfill that duty. And the budget I'm going to present represents a needs budget, not a wants budget, but what we need in my estimation. But it's just a starting point because, of course, the governor-elect will present her proposed budget to you after the session begins. So consider this just sort of an orientation, if you will. With that being said, let's take a look at the proposal. I'll go into more detail in a minute, but first the key 10,000-foot elements. Our recent Wayfair decision was a big win for South Dakota and other states nationwide. However, the FY20 revenue projection will not incorporate any potential new e-commerce sales tax revenue in the projection. I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. Overall, the economic and revenue outlook is generally positive. We've been experiencing positive trends so far in some key areas. Thirdly, I'm recommending a 2.3% inflationary increase for 3 key areas of Medicaid providers, education, and state employees. Fourthly, I'll be also recommending changes to the state employee health insurance program to assure it is structurally balanced. And finally, I have some recommendations for FY 2019, the year we're in right now, for one-time budget adjustments and emergency special appropriations. So now let's look at that first point, not budgeting for new e-commerce sales tax revenue. Why not? We discussed e-commerce a year ago in the budget speech, and this chart reminds us of the growth of United States retail e-commerce sales as published by the Census Bureau going back to year 2000. These are quarterly figures, each bar. Most recently from the third quarter of 2018, e-commerce sales that quarter totaled $130.9 billion nationwide, $130 billion nationwide, representing about 10% of total retail sales. In recent years, this growth, as you can see from the trajectory, has been increasing, and its current rate of increase is 15%. So that's why our remote seller law and our win at the court was so important. Without it, our sales tax base would erode and erode and erode as e-commerce grew. Because of our success in South Dakota versus Wayfair, we're now in a much better position as a state to maintain our sales tax base as consumers change the way they buy their goods. Looking at the chart, one might think that our new ability to require remote sellers to collect sales tax would result in big new revenue numbers. But let's look closer at that. Look at the blue bar on the far right. Again, that bar represents the most recent quarter, 130 billion of e-commerce. This chart now has the same data, and the blue bar on the far right still represents $130 billion, but it is placed in the context of total retail sales. The top of the right bar shows total U.S. retail sales in the third quarter of 2018 were about $1.3 trillion. So the point is, e-commerce sales represented about $130 billion, or 10% of the total. 10% of the total. So while e-commerce continues to grow, 10% is still a relatively small percentage of the total. Now, the other point to keep in mind is that South Dakota's sales tax base is much broader than just retail sales of goods. This pie chart reminds us that in South Dakota we have a very broad sales tax on most goods and services. E-commerce sales of goods may be rapidly growing, but e-commerce services, not so much. You can't get your house shingled online, you can't get your hair cut online, you can't change your car's oil online, you can't buy electricity or gas online. Most services are likely still being purchased in-state, meaning more than a third of our sales tax revenue today and in the future is probably not as vulnerable to e-commerce losses. So let's focus on just the goods. What share in South Dakota is purchased via e-commerce? Now, that's a difficult question to answer. If we're collecting about $1 billion total, and we are, if you look at our revenue projections for this year and next year, you'll see our projection is about $1 billion of sales and use tax. And one might estimate that we're collecting 37%, or 370 million of that, from services, and 63%, or 630 billion of that, from goods. So focus on that, 630 million from goods. And remember the prior chart, if 10% is coming from e-commerce, you might expect, well, if we're collecting 630 million today, when we add e-commerce, we might get 63 million more, right? No, that doesn't work because it ignores the e-commerce goods that are already being taxed. So which e-commerce goods were already being taxed before the Wayfair decision was handed down? Many online sellers like Amazon were voluntary payers. We remember a couple years ago we celebrated Amazon's decision to voluntarily start paying taxes on e-commerce. Others were, others were encouraged by Senate Bill 106 from the 2016 legislative session before our remote seller law was enforceable. And this voluntary compliance meant additional sales and use tax revenue these past 2 years has already been incorporated into our sales tax base. It's already part of that $1 billion number. This is a good thing, but it also means that the potential for new e-commerce sales tax is smaller. Also, some retailers with South Dakota stores have significant e-commerce. Stores like Walmart, Best Buy, Cabela's, Target, they all have significant e-commerce. And so they've been remitting tax on e-commerce sales for many years. And when you see that bar chart trajectory go up, some of those sales we've just been collecting when they were bought in Walmart at the counter, and we continue to collect when people switch to Walmart.com. So they really haven't added, even though that chart is growing and email commerce is growing, they really haven't added new sources of tax revenue for us. So it's challenging to know how much we've already been collecting. The point is, with the Wayfair decision, we just don't have any actual collection history to help predict how much additional sales tax this could mean. Additional uncertainties, our remote seller law that we passed in Senate Bill 106 has a small seller exemption for businesses with either fewer than 200 South Dakota transactions nor more than $100,000 of sales to South Dakota consumers. We have no idea how many remote sellers will be exempt under these thresholds. Finally, You might remember in the special session last fall, we passed legislation to require marketplace sellers to collect and remit sales tax for South Dakota. This requirement goes into effect on March 1st of next year. At that time, we don't know what the compliance rate will be. It's uncertain. We also don't know how many tax dollars will be captured from those kinds of sales. Marketplaces were not contemplated nor discussed in the Wayfair decision of the Supreme Court. So there are certainly some risks, even litigation risks, that are associated with our marketplace seller law. So the prudent course is to wait until we have the facts, and for now I'm recommending we do not budget for any additional sales tax revenue. We can always spend it if it arrives. We must wait, though, until we have actual collection experience. Again, our remote seller law for direct sellers went into effect November 1st. November collections are ongoing. They closed at the end of this month. Retailers will send that money to South Dakota at the end of December, and it will show up in our first report in January, the first week or early in the second week of January. So we won't know until early January what 1 month worth of direct marketplace seller revenue adds to our total revenue. We still won't have enough. And if you think about Senate Bill 2, the marketplace seller law, that seller law becomes effective March 1st of next year. Again, March collections will be remitted to the state at the end of April, and they'll show up in our May report. And so it won't be until May that we even have 1 month of marketplace collections. So we still won't have enough information to responsibly project fiscal year 2020 collections. Now, in spite of the uncertainties I just detailed, we have tried to do some rough analysis to judge potential sales tax from the Wayfair decision. As a reminder, none of this has been incorporated into the proposal that I will be laying out momentarily. There are too many uncertainties. Still, the Department of Revenue and the Bureau of Finance and Management have done a great deal of analysis of sales tax revenue from South Dakota and what we may be losing to e-commerce. And we've estimated the upper level of potential revenue in 2 different ways. And I'm going to talk about one of those ways. The first method is what I'm calling the top-down method. The best e-commerce data available is found in national figures from the U.S. Census Bureau's quarterly e-commerce retail sales report. You saw that in the bar chart just momentarily. In a full calendar year, U.S. e-commerce totaled $424 billion. Remember, we talked about 1 quarter recently was 130. A full year, 424 nationally, 424 billion. Drawing from various data points, we judged South Dakota would represent about 0.25% of that total sales figure, meaning about 1.06 billion of those sales would be to South Dakota buyers, okay? Then if we apply the South Dakota sales tax rate of 4.5%, this equates to approximately $48 million of sales tax. Now again, from that, we have to subtract some money that we've already been getting from voluntary payers and those others I described earlier. We believe that amount is roughly $25 million. Again, it's a rough estimate. This difference being $23 million is certainly one estimate of what could be collected on an annual basis. However, I want to caution you, it's likely it's too high because this would assume full compliance right away in fiscal year 2020, complete compliance, and there's no reduction for the small seller exemption either, because those census figures encapsulate all sellers, and they don't exclude the small sellers that our law does exclude. So that's one way to look at it. On the next chart, I'd like to look at another way of looking at the data to derive a sales tax estimate from e-commerce, and this is what I'm calling the bottom-up method. In data accessible to them, the Department of Revenue has identified the top 2 unlicensed marketplace sellers and the top 10 unlicensed sellers primarily engaged in e-commerce. Those represent what we believe would be the lion's share of e-commerce that we're not capturing now. Beyond the top 2 marketplaces and the top 10 individual e-commerce retailers, the amounts are very small. The amounts of e-commerce are very small, nearly irrelevant. So there's a small number of sellers that really are dominating the marketplace. Using the actual experience of a licensed marketplace here in South Dakota and an average of the 10 largest e-commerce retailers which are licensed in South Dakota, we asked ourselves, what share are they capturing of their total sales when they look at South Dakota buyers? And we judged that for the marketplaces, 0.11% of their sales are to South Dakota buyers. And for individual e-commerce retailers who are licensed already, they're capturing about 0.15 of their sales are to South Dakota buyers. And we applied those percentages to the 2 largest marketplaces. Those would be the unlicensed marketplace. I know this is getting confusing, but those 2 unlicensed ones are selling $242 billion total, and we multiply that to South Dakota's share, 0.11%, at our tax rate of 4.5%. That's where we get the $11.6 million in taxes that we'd collect from those 2 marketplace sellers who are presently unlicensed. We'd start collecting that again March 1st. Then from the 10 direct sellers, I'll call them, we applied the U.S. internet sales of those 10 remote sellers of $23.1 billion. That's their nationwide sales. And 0.15% are to South Dakota buyers. That's our guess. Times our 4.5% rate yields the 1.5% taxable collections. So there you have the total of $13.1 million in potential new sales tax. So those are a couple of different ways. Remember the $13 million figure here, the $23 million figure on the prior chart do not represent a range. They're not a range. It's not going to be between these two. They're both potential ceilings. And indeed, the actual collections could end up being even less than the $13 million. So there's just no way to know. There really is no way to know. And these are just 2 different ways of estimating using very rough assumptions. We simply don't have enough information to make a reliable estimate. At the end of the day, even though these 2 calculations do have logical bases, we're making very broad assumptions. And so because they may not be accurate, that's the reason I've not incorporated any revenue. Once we get a year's worth of history, again, these decisions will be up to you and to the new governor, not to me, but I'm selling you my idea anyway. Once you get a year's worth of history, then you have a logical and reasonable, responsible basis upon which to judge what will happen the following year. So there's my pitch. Now, let's discuss the revenue picture for the current year, the year we're in right now, fiscal year 2019. If you look at the adopted FY19 column on the left there, this was our ongoing revenue projection, the forecast that you adopted when the legislature adjourned last March. The adopted total, as you can see, was $1,641.5 million at the bottom of the left-hand numerical column. The next column shows today's revised projection. Some revenue is better, some worse. The last column shows our total ongoing revenue is almost exactly the same, just a shade lower, $2.3 million lower. Sales tax and use tax, you can see, is revised higher because we're seeing strength in that area. It's revised up $4.3 million. Through 4 months of the fiscal year, our sales tax has been running ahead of projections a little bit. We're currently growing 6.1% over last year's same time last year, a year ago. This is driven by higher consumer spending, and we're seeing some increased spending in the ag sector through equipment purchases, which is good to see. Lottery has been revised higher by $500,000. This includes instant, online, and video lottery receipts to the general fund. Video lottery revenue is running 3.9% higher than a year ago. Contractors' excise tax has been revised up by $1.7 million. So far this fiscal year, collections are up about 5% compared to a year ago. And we anticipate healthy housing and construction activity to continue. And of course, this impacts the contractors' excise tax. Insurance company tax up 0.9 million, as collections finished 2018 higher than anticipated, and we project it to be higher than in 2019. Unclaimed property has been revised lower by $6.5 million compared to the adopted estimate. As you may know, the majority of dormant unclaimed property comes to the state on November 1st. So we have actual experience now versus what we thought we might get when the legislature adopted the original estimate. The collections were lower than budgeted. We still have claims to pay out the remaining rest of this fiscal year. And after those claims are all paid out, we're projecting we'll have $43 million left. So that's why that's amended down to $43 million. This particular revenue source is very unpredictable. Revenue does the best it can, but it's very difficult. So I'd encourage you to be cautious as you budget for unclaimed property in the future. The remaining revisions roughly offset each other. Total ongoing receipts is $1,639.2 million, which again is $2.3 million lower than adopted last March. Now remember that $2.3 million revenue lower figure, okay? We're going to talk about this again later. Now let's look at FY 2020, next year, the year that begins July 1st. This chart adds recommended FY 2020 ongoing receipts. The far right column shows the change in millions as compared to the FY 2019 adopted estimate. Sales and use tax, starting on the left and going right, $1,029.1 million was the adopted FY 2019 estimate. We're revising it up to $1,033.4 million. And then for 2020, forecast is $1,073.3 million. The increase of $44.2 million shown on the far right is compared to the FY 2019 adopted figure, the far left. This represents how much new sales tax we'll have for new 2020 expenses, if you want to expend more than you're spending in today's FY19 budget. Lottery as a revenue is expected to grow $3.4 million. Contractors excise tax $6.4 million. Insurance company tax up $4.7. They reflect normal growth rates, assuming a steady growing economy. Unclaimed property, we're saying we should keep it at the FY19 revised figure at $43 million. That's still $6.5 million below the adopted number. License permits and fees estimate is up $2.3 million, primarily normal growth in security licensing fees. Tobacco taxes are down $2.5 million. This reflects the long-term decline in this area, primarily the cigarette tax, as fewer people are smoking. Bank franchise tax projected to be up $0.8 million as interest rate rise. We're going to have some better profitability there. Other ongoing receipts are equal to the adopted FY19 figure. So in total, for 2020, I propose a revenue forecast of $1,694.6 million, and this is the key number at the bottom right, $53.1 million in new ongoing revenue. $53.1 million in new ongoing revenue in 2020. Now that we've reviewed the revenue picture and discussed e-commerce, let's review how I would recommend to spend the $53.1 million. I'm recommending an inflationary increase of 2.3% for medical provider reimbursement rates. For education, I'm recommending an increase of 2.3% for K-12 schools and the technical institutes. This increase follows the formula in statute. And then for state employees, I'm recommending a 2.3% increase, as well as funding to structurally balance the state employee health plan. My recommendation includes funding for maintenance and repair budgets, and although this funding does not get us to our target of 2%, it does keep pace with construction costs and the phase-in of new buildings. Finally, we have expense reductions due to an increase in the federal medical assistance percentage, FMAP is the acronym. That is the share of Medicaid payments covered by the federal government. Although this is good news from a budget standpoint, it means that South Dakota's trailing 3-year average of per capita income growth is less than the national 3-year average. Let's take a closer look at the dollar costs of all these recommendations. For medical provider inflation, $13.4 million. That's a 2.3% increase. This is slightly more than the projected 2.2% FY 2020 Consumer Price Index growth rate. The increases are in the Departments of Social Services, Human Services, Corrections, Health, Public Safety, and the Unified Judicial System. And this category also includes some rate increases that are mandated by the federal government. Second line there, consumer expansion, $10.4 million. This is for increased consumption of existing programs. This includes increases in programs such as long-term care in the Department of Human Services, Criminal Justice Initiative treatment in the Department of Social Services, and dual credit in the Department of Education. I consider that good news when we see that consumption increase. State aid education is $9.4 million. For education, the statutory funding formula calls for an increase of 2.3%, and that's my recommendation, 2.3%. I'm also recommending 2.3% increase to the per-student allocation for technical institutes. Our most valuable resource is state employee salary policy at $8.7 million. That's our human resource. And our employees are below the market now. We study this every 4 years with a pretty comprehensive salary study of our private sector and surrounding states' public sector, and we are below the market in South Dakota when it comes to salary and benefits. I'm recommending a 2.3% across-the-board increase for state employee salaries. The next line, state employee health insurance, $6.9 million. Let's take a look at this in more detail. The state of South Dakota, you may know, has a self-insured health plan, and we've always actively managed that to try and control costs. We make plan design changes annually, which often pushes costs onto the employees. Example, the low deductible health plan deductible amount has more than tripled since I've been governor. We've eliminated an entire plan. Employees used to have 3 plans from which to choose. Now there's just 2. We've increased the out-of-pocket maximum a number of times since I've been governor. We encourage employees to use the high deductible plan because it's cheaper for the state. Again, puts more risk on the employee. We are seeing good migration there, but again, the employees end up having a higher deductible and they're bearing more of the health costs. We've been able to infuse some one-time cash into the plan at times to buy down impacts to employees. And let me say, our state employee health insurance cost increases, they trend lower than the national average. So we are managing it well, in my estimation. Listen to this figure. Since 2011, the state paid premium has gone up an average of only 4.3% per year. Ask your constituents if they'd be happy with a 4.3% increase for the last 8 years in their health premiums. But regardless, our health care costs continue to rise, and we're proposing to structurally balance the state employee health plan. What I mean by that is we've got about $5 million in our kind of emergency cushion in this plan, and if we make these changes, we hope to maintain that. We won't add to it, we won't eat away at it, but we'll maintain that. We need $19.5 million to make that happen. So for the first time ever, I'm recommending instituting an employee premium. Right now, as a state employee, I don't pay a premium for my health care coverage. I pay a premium for Linda's health care coverage as a dependent, but I don't pay a premium as an employee. I'm recommending that we start charging a modest premium. This, along with some prescription plan changes, will bring about $4.1 million into the plan. You can see that on the top line. Now, that doesn't leverage any federal funds when we charge a premium. I'm recommending also, though, that an employer increase, the state general funds, pay $6.9 million. You can see that under general fund costs, $6.9 million. That will leverage federal funds, so it'll create a total of $15 million. You add that 15 to the 4, and that creates the $19.5 million roughly that we need to have the plan in structural balance. This change will require an amendment to state statute because right now in law, the state is prohibited from charging an employee health premium. So you'd have to change the statute. And as I said, an employer increase of $6.9 million there on the left. That will leverage federal funds to create a total of 15.4 when added to the 4, gets us to the number we need. All right, let's get back to the expense summary. Right below state employee health insurance, maintenance, and repair, I'm recommending $5.2 million funding to help maintain and extend the useful life of state-owned buildings. We have deferred maintenance budgets in the Board of Regents, Bureau of Administration, Department of the Military, and the Technical Institutes. And this recommendation, as I said, does not get us to our 2% target. It does keep pace with construction costs and the phase-in of some new buildings. So we make a little progress. Next is Title 19 Medicaid FMAP savings. As I said, the FMAP is going up. It means the federal government is paying a little bit more of each Medicaid dollar, reimbursing us a little bit more. We project that'll save us about $6.2 million. And then miscellaneous increases and decreases net to additional expenses of $5.2 million. As you can see, this totals $52.9 million in increases, essentially using all the money from the new revenue that we project. So the bottom line for FY 2020, $53.1 million of new revenue. The spending I just detailed, $52.9 million in ongoing expenses, leaving a small surplus on the bottom line, $187,000. All right, that's FY 2020 budget. Now let's come back to the current year's budget, FY 19. Let's discuss the changes we need to make in the current year. Here are the mid-year expense adjustments for FY 2019 I'm recommending. For the Department of Social Services utilization, I recommend a reduction in the appropriation of $8.8 million. These reductions are due to fewer than projected Medicaid enrollees, lower utilization, and lower costs. State aid education, I recommend a reduction in the appropriation of $6.9 million. This reduction is due to lower than projected student numbers. We always project, because we get data from all the school districts, how many students do you think, we're budgeting now, it's March, how many students are we going to have in September? And they do their best to judge what the number will be. They gave us that number last March, and they had fewer than that number enroll. So we're lower than projected student numbers in K-12 schools, and we had higher than projected property tax valuations. When you set the property tax levy, just before you leave, if the evaluations or assessments go up higher than that, then that multiplier times that higher number results in higher local effort, reducing the state effort required. So those are a couple of big dollar savings amounts that are in the FY19 expense budget that we can reduce. And then we've got some miscellaneous increases and decreases that add up to a little over $65,000. Total mid-year adjustments, reduction in appropriations of $15.6 million, nearly 15.7. With that money, I'm proposing a number of emergency special appropriations for FY 2019. The first is the Jamison Annex expansion. Some of you in the Appropriations Committee visited the Jamison medical facilities last year, not in 2018, but in 2017, I believe. This appropriation of $7.4 million is for the construction of a health services building at the Jamison Prison Annex. This is in Sioux Falls. We've discussed this building internally for many years. I've never had the money to propose this expenditure by the appropriation. I even went to the Helmsley Trust and asked for a charitable gift because I truly believe we need this. But we've just not had the ability to do it. This year we do. This building is needed due to an increased count of inmates that's occurred over a number of years. The Jamison Prison Annex was built 25 years ago to serve 288 inmates. The inmate count just a few weeks ago was 521 inmates. And in addition to that, there are also 214 more in the Sioux Falls Community Work Center. And they also received their health care at the Jamison Annex facility. So a total of 735 inmates are using a space designed for 288. And because of the increased number, there's also a lack of space and the National Commission on Correctional Health Care has identified several areas of marginal or non-compliance at the Jameson Annex. They include need for more workstation space for nursing and security staff, offices for providers like doctors and nurses, and a secure medical storage area. Your Appropriations Committee might have seen the medical supplies are stored in a furnace room. The need for more infirmary beds and the need to locate the infirmary closer to the clinic. We're observing patients who are in the infirmary through video cameras because the provider space is so far away from the space we can use. We need dedicated space for things like dialysis and physical therapy. We don't have adequate sterilization space in the dental clinic, inadequate waiting areas. Someone who's in the dental chair can reach out and touch the people who are waiting to be served. You know, it's not good to have prisoners that can reach out and touch each other. This is not good. So anyway, this is a significant appropriation, but I hope you will consider it. If Governor Noem recommends it, I hope she will consider it also. Let's move on. Here are the remaining special appropriations I recommend. The National Guard Readiness Center, $3.9 million. The FY19 budget funded the first year, you might remember, of a 3-year plan to build a National Guard Readiness Center at the Rapid City Regional Airport, where we have a Guard unit station. This 3.9 would cover years 2 and 3, so we'd get it all done this year. To bring total state funding to $5 million, and to that we get to add $15 million of federal funds. The Extraordinary Litigation Fund, $2.3 million. This is to backfill the Extraordinary Litigation Fund for litigation expenses not covered by the Public Entity Pool for Liability Fund. The Metrology Lab, $1.7 million. This is to renovate a building in Sturgis for the State Metrology Lab, as a new lab is needed to be in compliance with national standards and to get recertified. Healthcare Recruitment Assistance Program, $980,000. This is funding that will pay for healthcare professionals such as physicians, dentists, nurse practitioners. You've seen this every year. These are people we put in rural areas, and we promise if you stay there and practice, then we'll reimburse your tuition costs. That's what this is. People who have met that precondition. Wildland Fire Suppression Fund, $907,000 to backfill the fund for wildland fires. Emergency and Disaster Fund, $551,000. This backfills that funds for costs related to emergencies and disasters in South Dakota outside the wildfire area. Elm Lake Dam, $521,000. This is for part of the cost to replace the Elm Lake Dam near Aberdeen. And finally, one you see every year, tax refunds for the elderly, $450,000 to pay for refunds of sales tax or property tax for elderly and disabled persons that meet low-income guidelines. So the total, as you can see, is $18,645,626. So the bottom line, this will summarize the budget adjustments I'm recommending for FY 2019, the current year. Remember, our FY19 ongoing revenue is projected to be lower by $2.3 million, so that's shown in parentheses in red. I'm recommending a cash transfer of $700,000 from the Department of Ag to the general fund. This is money that was allocated for mountain pine beetle mitigation that's no longer needed. Also, I'm proposing to use $7.3 million from the Budget Reserve Fund. After we take $7.3 million out, we will still have a 10% reserve of the 2020 proposed budget. Next is a total of mid-year expense adjustments, which I detailed in an earlier slide, expense reductions that we talked about earlier, $15.7 million. It's shown here as a positive number because it contributes to the bottom line because we're saving expenses, we're not spending money. Finally, I'm recommending the $18.6 million in emergency appropriations that I just detailed on the last slide. The Jameson Annex, the metrology, all that added up, you might remember, to $18.6 million. So that's shown in parentheses again. That leaves $2.7 million on the bottom line. I'm sure many of you will have ideas how to spend one-time money, and if your colleagues agree, there's some money there available. And if not, these funds can stay in the budget reserve and be saved for future consideration. So the total, let's take a final look at FY19 and 20. I'm proposing a revised budget in FY19 of $4.8 billion. Now I'm on the revised center line there at the bottom, $4.8 billion, and recommending again a $4.8 billion total budget in FY 2020. Both years are honestly balanced, with ongoing expenses supported only by ongoing revenue that we can predict with responsibility. Now, all that being said, as you know, this is my last budget proposal and our last time together. So I hope you'll indulge me as I offer some parting words. During the 8 years I've served in office, I'm very proud of the approach we've taken in our budgeting. And I'm proud of the strong financial position of our state. For the new legislators who are here today, and as a reminder to all of us, I want to review some of the elements of our approach that I think is very responsible in South Dakota. This chart illustrates our ongoing revenue, represented by the black line, compared to our ongoing expenses, represented by the red line. 8 years ago, when I was elected governor, our budget was in structural deficit. You can see that in the red shaded area in the graph. The Great Recession had caused our revenue to fall in FY09. You see the black line going down, and fall still further in FY10. And we were using federal stimulus money to fill the gap several years in a row. You can see it in 09, 10, and again in 11. In my first budget proposal for FY12, I proposed a 10% cut to all areas of spending to get our budget in order. I cut my own salary 15%. It wasn't popular. Well, that part was popular. That part was popular. It wasn't popular, but we were able to get that done together. Many of you in this room were here. Since that time, we've been able to make investments in key areas while at the same time holding our ongoing spending at or below our ongoing revenue levels. This discipline has led to a structurally balanced budget every year since FY12, which is something to be proud of. Structural balance every year. Thank you. Having a structurally balanced budget, and what's a structurally balanced budget? Remember, it means when you know you have ongoing expenses, you only budget from revenues that you know will also be ongoing. Some states don't do that. We do that. And we do that without using one-time gimmicks. It's critically important. I hope you'll continue this practice as you work with Governor-elect Noem and her administration in developing a budget every year. When I took office during FY 2011, there were 13,612 FTE, full-time equivalent employees, in state government. Of those, 7,905 were under the control of the governor. That's shown on the blue line. And 5,707 were outside the governor's control, shown on the red line. Today, I'm recommending to you a budget consisting of 14,015 FTE. And while the FTE outside the governor's control have grown by 461 since FY 2011, FTE under the governor's control are 58 fewer than when I first took office. Budgeting conservatively has allowed us to have budget surpluses for 7 straight years. Remember, these are actual cash surpluses at the end of the fiscal year, after the legislature is able to make mid-year budget adjustments, just like those I recommended moments ago in the middle of FY 2019. In FY 2012, coming out of the recession, our revenue recovered much more quickly than we expected, and we ended with a $47.8 million surplus at year end. Even in FY 2017, when revenue came in short of expectations, we projected revenue here, and then at the December budget address, I recommended cutting it. When the legislature adjourned, you cut it still further, and when actual revenue came in, it was lower than that. So we were below our revenue our adopted revenue in FY17, but our spending was still lower than we'd appropriated. So we still had a budget surplus, because as we approached the year end, I could see our revenue wasn't going to make it. So I just said to all the agencies, put the brakes on hard, because we're not going to end the year in a deficit. We're going to end the year in a surplus, and we did. We ended the year with a $7.9 million cash surplus. Last fiscal year, ended June 30th, both higher revenue and lower spending contributed to a $16.9 million surplus this past June 30th. In each of the past 7 years, we finished the fiscal year without needing to use any reserve funds to balance at fiscal year end. And these year-end surpluses flow into the budget reserve fund, and they're available to be spent the following year, just as I recommended spending some of our budget reserve a moment ago in FY19. This chart on the next page here shows the balance of our reserve funds as a percentage of our budget over the past 8 years with projections for 2019 and 2020. As you can see, in FY11, after the recession years, we had a little over 9% in reserve. Since then, we've maintained reserves at or above 10% of our general fund appropriations. Nationally, the median state budget reserve balance is about 6.2%, with half the states above that and half the states below that. Of course, we're above that. Our policy has been to maintain a combined balance of reserves equal to 10% of our general fund budget. When our reserves have been in excess of 10%, then we've used that extra for one-time expenses such as debt reduction or addressing emergencies. Today, you can see the box on the right, we have $176.4 million in reserves, which is $7.3 million above our 10% goal. And that's the $7.3 million I just mentioned a minute ago that I recommend we spend in FY19. So these budget principles, as well as many other improved financial practices, have paid dividends. When I took office 8 years ago, one of my goals was to elevate South Dakota's credit rating. Over the past 3 years, we've achieved and maintained a AAA credit rating with all 3 major credit rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And I'd like to review some of the steps that we took so that you understand how important it is to maintain some of these things. In the 2011 session, I proposed, as you know, and the legislature agreed to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot to explicitly require a balanced budget. This was passed by the people of South Dakota with 65% approval in 2012. And not long after the 10% budget cuts, our credit rating was raised from AA to AA+. Then in 2014, I proposed legislation, and the legislature approved to formalize in state law more frequent revenue estimates by both the Bureau of Finance and Management and the Legislative Research Council to identify any potential revenue shortfalls sooner. Through an executive order in 2014, we began posting budget metrics, so you can find them online. On the BFM website, each week we post more information, current information, to detail monthly expenditures, revenue collections, cash balances, various different funds. We eliminated many liabilities from our financial statements by using one-time money. This includes early repayment of long-term bonds of $56 million in 2014 and $42 million in 2016, as well as eliminating what's called other post-employment benefits liability. We completely eliminated. Many states have large OPEB liabilities. In 2015, we published a long-term financial plan, a 5-year capital expenditure plan, and a debt limitation policy for the first time. These were required annually by an executive order I issued, and then they were later, at my request, placed into statute. You passed those statutes, and now in state law, we have strict limits on the amount of debt that can be issued through the South Dakota Building Authority. In December of 2016, for the first time in 20 years, we issued our audited financial statement. That's called the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report within 6 months of the close of the fiscal year. We've now accomplished this for 2 years in a row, and I expect we'll meet this goal again this month by completing our FY 2018 financial statements before December 31st. Lastly, but very importantly, we fully funded and proactively managed our strong retirement system in South Dakota. Many states have enormous unfunded pension liabilities. South Dakota is a shining star in this area. Our retirement system is 100% funded. Wisconsin and Washington can also make this claim. No other state can. While other states use unrealistic assumptions and has made many adjustments, such as higher rate of return. They project what their value is using very unreasonable rates of return, and still they don't show themselves 100% funded. South Dakota retirement system conversely uses realistic assumptions and has made many adjustments to keep those assumptions realistic over the past several years. And the Board of Trustees is doing a stellar job of making sure our funding is 100% over the long haul. Each of these things up there have played a part in earning a AAA rating from all 3 credit rating agencies. And Moody's and S&P both reaffirmed that rating just last month. So it's something we can be very proud of. Thank you. Thank you. So we can be proud of our AAA rating and all the work we've done to achieve it, but if you take a step back, I'm not proud of the AAA rating for its own sake. And it does earn our state lower borrowing costs, and I'm happy about that, but I'm not even happy about it for that reason, really. The reason I'm proud of it is because it's a recognition that in South Dakota we do things the right way. We're responsible stewards of state dollars and state assets. And you've heard me say it many times, but I'll say it again. We don't spend money we don't have. We're adults. We're adults in South Dakota. We use one-time revenue only for one-time expenses, and we fund ongoing expenses with only ongoing revenue. Many states don't do this. It just amazes me. We maintain 10% budget reserves, and we use those reserves for emergencies, not to perpetuate overspending. And we conservatively project our revenue and our expenses. We don't use accounting gimmicks, so we don't balance by pushing expenses into the next year and say we're balanced because no, we're not spending that money till after June 30th. And we don't use an acceleration of income into the current year by robbing next year. We don't use those gimmicks. We use one-time windfalls to repay debt early. Who does that? No states don't do that. South Dakota does that. And we structurally balance our budget every year, not only because our state constitution requires it, but because it's the right thing to do. And we feel good about doing the right thing. I'm very pleased to be turning over this office to Governor-elect Noem, who also believes in these principles and will continue to emphasize sound financial management. We've been fortunate in South Dakota to have many governors and many legislators of both parties who've kept our finances on track for years. And I hope we never take that for granted. Just last month, I participated in the National Governors Association School for New Governors. Governor-elect Noem was there. We had the chance to visit with some new governors. I happened to sit next to the governor of Illinois at dinner. I had conversation with the new governor of Connecticut one afternoon. Let me tell you, those governors are both walking into a terrible mess, and they know it. They have massive unfunded pension liabilities and huge unsustainable budget deficits. You know, some states get into this political push-pull. They have a governor of one party and a legislature of the other party. That's not true there in Illinois. That's not true in Delaware. That's not true in other states that have same party executive and legislative. They run into trouble because they can't control themselves. South Dakota is not in that position. As I leave you, our state's finances are the envy of the nation, and I want to thank you for that. When I first came into office 8 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, our state faced very difficult times. A deficit of $127 million, and I propose we eliminate that deficit in 1 year. We ripped off the Band-Aid. And it wasn't an easy thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. And many of you here and your predecessors showed great courage in supporting those cuts. And in some ways, you had it tougher than I did. You go home on weekends. You go to Cracker Barrels, you go to church, you hear from educators and Medicaid providers and state employees, and you're on the front lines, but you stayed with me, and together we put South Dakota back on the right track. And I won't forget that, and I thank you for that. Then that same year came the Missouri River floods. Releases from the Oahe Dam were nearly triple the previous record over a 50-year span. the record was beat by nearly triple. Large portions of Pierre and nearly all of Fort Pierre and Dakota Dunes were threatened by the flooding. In a matter of days, we filled hundreds and thousands of sandbags. We built emergency levees that saved most of Pierre and Fort Pierre and Dakota Dunes. Thousands of South Dakotans stepped up. National Guard, law enforcement, first responders, busloads of volunteers, hundreds of truckers, and prison inmates. As I said at the time, as high as the floodwaters had risen, South Dakota rose even higher. And I saw that spirit again and again over the 8 years I've been governor. Winter Storm Atlas, tornadoes in Washington Springs and Delmont, fires in the Black Hills. I'll never forget that. That spirit again and again, South Dakotans helping each other. Those aren't the easiest moments, but they're the times when I was most proud to be governor of South Dakota. And I think of all the times through the years when we've worked together to make our state better. We worked to bring reform to our education system, to make our funding formula more fair, to get teacher salaries out of last place. We fought together for sales tax fairness and led the states to a historic victory at the Supreme Court. We prioritized the maintenance and repair of our highways, our bridges, and our state buildings. We created a new state park and expanded opportunities at the others. We made the largest investment in drug and mental health treatment in state history. And we made our technical institutes the envy of the nation. And we did it all together. I know we didn't always agree on everything, but that's all right, as part of the process. In South Dakota, we don't let ideology get in the way of solving problems. And we don't let politics get in the way of professionalism, respect, and friendship. That's why our state works. That's why our legislature works. And as I end 22 years of service in this Capitol, I thank you all for that. I hope that never changes. Thank you. I'm almost done, but there are a few more people I'd like to thank. I'm very thankful for the many fine people who have helped me over the years. On many occasions, your advice, counsel, and hard work has made me look good. I'm not going to miss the busy schedule of governor. I'm not going to miss the meetings. The governor's mansion is nice, but I'm not even going to miss that. But I will miss the people. I will miss the people. Up on the screen, I've listed the names of everyone who has served on my cabinet or on my staff. It takes so many good people, and many of them are here today. I'd like, if your name is listed, and I know the font is small, but if your name is listed, I'd like you to stand, and I'd ask the legislature to help me thank them. Please stand if you're a member of my cabinet or staff or past members. I want to say a special thank you to Tony Van Huysen. He's been a great communicator and a great chief of staff, and thanks, Tony, for helping me get elected and for sticking with me all 8 years. You've been a great friend. And although I've said it before, I'd like to say again thanks to Matt Michaels. Matt's been a great lieutenant governor in so many ways. He cares about the rules, the process, and the calendar, all those things that a presiding officer must care about. But more than anything, Matt cares about people. Please help me thank Lieutenant Governor Matt Michaels. Last page. My family's in the gallery today at the back. Laura and Sarah and Chris all sacrificed. They all sacrificed to let me serve. They sacrificed their time to help me get elected. They sacrificed their privacy. As children of the governor, you're under the microscope. And the demands of this schedule meant we lost so much time that we would otherwise spend together. I am so looking forward to more time as your dad again. Let's see, there was someone else. Someone else. Henry, no. Oh, yeah, Linda. Of course, Linda. She's been a great First Lady, a great First Lady. From her work to reduce infant mortality, to her hours and hours and hours of reading in schools, 285 schools, grades 3, grades 4, grade 5, every one of them. She promoted foster care too, trying to recruit foster parents. But as much as she's been a terrific First Lady, she's been a loving and devoted wife. Fiercely loyal, but always ready to tell me when I was wrong or oblivious to something. Linda, thanks for being with me on this journey. I love you. Finally, as I close, I'd like to say a few words about my parents. As you know, Mom and Dad were born deaf. They were both born deaf, but they did not allow that to deter them. They worked hard on our farm for years, and once we were old enough, my sisters and I worked hard too. When Dad had financial troubles and had to sell the livestock and equipment, he didn't use his deafness as an excuse. He and my mother drove 50 miles every day to work as janitors in the dormitories at Augustana. It was work that some people would not accept. But my parents taught me that all work has dignity. Most people wouldn't call my father a particularly successful man. He died with very little. But he worked hard, he took care of himself, and he paid his bills. He was self-reliant, persistent, and frugal, and he was successful to me. South Dakota is a special place because there are many, many people who carry those same values with them and set that same example in their lives every day. That's why I love South Dakota. And that's why it's been my great honor to be your governor. And that is why I know that our best days are still yet to come. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
And that will wrap up Governor Dennis Daugaard's farewell speech as the governor of South Dakota, along with his budget proposal for fiscal year 2020. The end of that speech becoming very sincere as he thanked his family for their sacrifice over the last 8 years, specifically mentioned his children, and looking forward to being their dad again, saying thank you to the First Lady for all of her work in terms of working on early learning and reading among our children. Thanked his cabinet, had all of those that served in his cabinet over the last 8 years stand up. They were recognized as well. Of course, Governor Daugaard spending the last 8 years as governor, but really a public servant for South Dakota over the last 22 years, starting his journey in this field as a state lawmaker so many years ago. He did offer his budget recommendations. Of course, Governor-elect Kristi Noem will take over in January. They have been working somewhat together on the budget recommendations that he laid out, knowing that Governor-elect Noem will deliver her own recommendations to the new legislature when they convene back here in January of 2019. E-commerce started off the governor's speech today as the Wayfair decision was done this last year, many wondering how much tax will come in, sales tax, in terms of e-commerce. It is too early to tell right now, is what the governor talked about. He suggested waiting, giving it a year before really looking at those numbers. None of those numbers were put into his proposal for fiscal year 2020. Some of the other stuff that the governor talked about were emergency appropriations for 2019. Looking roughly, the Jamison Annex was one of those. Some additions need to be made to the prison there to accommodate the prisoners. Also talked about the National Guard Readiness Center. There was some money there. Extraordinary Litigation Fund, Healthcare Recruitment Assistance Program, the Wildlife Suppression Fund, also tax refund for the elderly, which is something that we've seen as a special and emergency appropriation here. Roughly about $18.6 million in terms of emergency special appropriations for 2019, something that next year's legislature will be tackling. That will leave about $2.7 million in surplus. Of course, Governor Daugaard indicating that the upcoming legislature can do as they want with that $2.7 million, whether they choose to spend it or leave it in the budget for future things. He had some parting words to share. He really talked about the structural deficit when he came in. It was tough in 2011, having to rip that Band-Aid off. It was tough to do, but over his term as governor, each year South Dakota has had a structurally sound budget. We're going to do some follow-up interviews with state lawmakers, and Lee, I understand you're ready to go.
Standing here with State Representative Jamie Smith. You are the new House Minority Leader starting next year out of Sioux Falls, District 15. What kind of stuck out with you to you in this address?
You know, I thought the governor did a nice job explaining the situation with the internet sales tax and where we're at. I think it's a wise move to not count on that money yet, know that it's coming. So that is a major portion of what he talked about today, because we know that there's a little more money there, but I think it's wise to know how much before we spend it. So I appreciated that. I appreciate the increases that he's requesting for education and for healthcare providers, also for our state employees. I hope we notice, though, that raise to state employees is not as much as it looks like with the 2.3%, because we are passing along some healthcare costs to those families in premium. So I want to point that out. The other thing that we failed to see that as a Democrat we would like to see is we have no new money spent on perhaps pre-K education. That's something that's very important to us. Also, needs-based scholarships. That's something the legislature is going to have to deal with. And there was a little bit of money left over that he talked about. And so you'll see us trying to figure out ways to improve our state with that, with those funds.
No news in that, Daugaard presenting a cautious budget. But how do Democrats anticipate working with an incoming Noem administration?
that's yet to be seen. Right now, the tenets that she ran on were to help education, help healthcare, help government accountability, and all those things that, as a Democrat, I want those things. And so together we're going to figure out how to move forward on that. We're going to find out where we have commonalities and where we can work together, and where we have disagreements, we will work to overcome those.
And it seems like the state's starting to finally see some positive ag news, despite some cautious, I guess, reporting from the Federal Reserve out of the 9th District showing an increase in bankruptcies on the farm. Are you seeing that positive farm ag?
The numbers we got today from the governor were there was an uptick, and there was a bit of an uptick in spending by farmers on equipment and those things that help with the sales tax revenue. That being said, I still am concerned about our family farmers. I am concerned about the tariffs on soybeans and things like that we have going on right now. I know it's hurting our farmers, and a strong farm economy is good for South Dakota.
Thank you, Representative. Steph, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Representative, for that. We're going to continue to interview state lawmakers as we talk about what they heard today and what their hopes are as they move into the 2019 legislative session. Again, Governor Dennis Daugaard wrapping up his term as governor of South Dakota, his farewell address today, as well as his proposal for fiscal year 2020, also listing in there some of those special appropriations that we'll need to see for 2019 when the legislature convenes in January. Those state lawmakers will tackle all of those, as will Governor-elect Noem, who has been part of the structuring and the decision-making and discussions of the budget with Governor Daugaard. She'll come in with her own budget proposal, her and her administration, in January, but of course this is a starting point for Governor-elect Noem. As the governor talked today to state lawmakers, he also looked back during his 8 terms as our chief executive officer, coming in 2011, having to balance the budget, cutting not only state employee salaries, but a 15% cut on his own salary as our governor. Shortly after that, South Dakota would be hit with a devastating flood. He talked about the resilience of South Dakotans and their ability to come together and help one another. That was definitely a difficult time for him as governor, but a difficult time in history for all of South Dakota. Storm Atlas that would then hit, South Dakotans coming together. Some challenging times for Governor Daugaard as he worked on running our state government, all that goes into it, and reminiscing back over those 8 years and how really it's the people of South Dakota that he's going to miss, but he's so looking forward to spending more time with his wife Linda, our First Lady, his children, and his grandchildren. We're going to continue to work on some of those interviews for you. I know Lee Strubinger is on the floor of the House of Representatives. We've still got a few lawmakers that are roaming here in the House of Representatives, some staying until tomorrow as orientation is expected to take place for some of the new lawmakers that are coming in, and of course some of those that will be continuing their term here. Lee, I understand you're ready. Go ahead, sir.
Standing here with incoming Speaker of the House, Representative Stephen Daugaard out of District 10, which is Northeast Sioux Falls. I guess reaction to the governor's budget address.
Well, I appreciated his comments. You know, it's consistent with what his format has been over the years and his interest in keeping the budget as flat as possible. I'm optimistic that we can take a look at some of the things he's presented as concerns. Those are simply things that he sees as recommendations at this point, and the incoming governor, of course, she'll present her own budget with her own ideas. I suspect it's going to be a little flatter budget with her. I think that's her intention coming in, so we'll see how that affects any of the agencies and the processes that are going on already.
So you see that flatter budget, maybe her wanting to come in and adding more to the surplus?
Well, I would think there's going to be some of that, but I think for the most part, instead of seeing growth in the budget or the growth in the agency, she's going to hold those pretty tight. And I think that'd be appropriate for the next year or two and figure out exactly what her agenda is going to be.
I wanted to ask this question. So state government in South Dakota hasn't known this millennium without Governor Daugaard. What do you think that's going to look like, kind of after he's gone?
Well, I think what it's going to look like is probably a little, like I say, a little tighter budget. Try to improve the efficiencies of the agencies, and I think that's been going on for the past probably 4 to 6 years anyway. And even when the governor came into office and he saw the need to tighten the budget by 10%, and what he had told the agencies at that point is he told them, I want to see a 15% reduction, but ultimately he reduced it by 10. He just wanted to make sure that they had the fat that they could trim out of there, that they were actually doing that. So he's held government in check as much as possible from his perspective. I suspect it might be a little tighter in the coming administration.
And news came out yesterday that State Senator Deb Peters is not going to be here next session. There's a lot of missing people who were on appropriations last year that won't be on there this coming year. Any sort of thoughts onto who might be in appropriations or what appropriations is going to look like next year?
Well, the idea of appropriations really shouldn't be just a calculation of how you can spend all the incoming revenue. It should be a calculation of what do we really need. And we're hoping to take a closer look at those things to figure out what are the bare bones, and then what are the things that are important, and try to bring it down to a point of efficiency and effectiveness.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker. Steph, back to you.
All right, thank you so much. And of course, our upcoming Speaker of the House, Representative Stephen Daugaard, joining us. I'm now joined by Representative Lana Greenfield from Dolan. Representative, thank you for being with me. Always good to see you back here in Pierre. What are your thoughts on what you heard today?
Well, I think that the Governor Daugaard, hit it right on. He came in at a very difficult time in year 2010, and he had to start doing some cutting of the budget because our economy was in the tank. And that was not the popular thing to do at the time. And I think that, he had a very tough go of it, but I think he proved himself worthy of being governor by taking that tough stand. And as he said, now the economy has gotten solidified, and we're up and hopefully out of the depths of the destruction that we were seeing in the year 2010. So I think he did a really good job.
Next year, you will have had a few years under your belt here as one of our state public servants, a state lawmaker. We've got a new administration coming in with Governor-elect Noem. What are your thoughts as we move into 2019 and this new administration that's coming in?
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I think our Governor-elect Kristi Noem is going to do an excellent job at towing the mark. I think that she's a very good business person, and I think that she will continue to keep our economy very stable, and she will continue to try to expand our building in the state of South Dakota, attracting new industry into our state, and just continue in a very, very positive way.
Are there any particular issues that you know of right now that you are looking forward to working on?
Well, one thing that we need to do is to try to keep our nursing homes open. This has been a real problem in the last couple of years, and I think I have the positive side of the governor-elect that she will probably try to do something to increase our Medicaid money so that we can get more money coming into our nursing homes so that they can stay open. And that's one thing that I'm very, very passionate about, is our nursing homes and keeping the people where they are in the communities. It's not very much fun if they have to move out of their communities into unknown surroundings. So hopefully that will be a goal for one thing.
Do you anticipate that will come up during the session, or are you hoping it will come up?
I think it will come up because I think we're going to have to do something to cover these increased Medicaid costs in our nursing homes.
All right, very good. Well, we look forward to seeing you, and of course, Senator Brock Greenfield, where both of you will be here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
All right, and that will wrap up SDPB's coverage of the governor's budget address. As we say goodbye today, just a reminder, in January, all lawmakers will head back to Pierre for the oath of office. That will take place January 5th. SDPB will be there to cover the oath of office, as well as the Grand March later that night after the swearing-in ceremonies. Our entire SDPB team will be here in Pierre, making sure you have access on radio, on television, and online during the 2019 legislative session. On behalf of all of us with South Dakota Public Broadcasting, we thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.
State House program funding provided by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, the educational and charitable arm of South Dakota lawyers and judges.